So just take a bird's eye view of where we are right now. Remember that Ryle seems to have a strong point against Descartes because he seems to be able to argue with some persuasiveness that Descartes' view of the mind takes it to be a substance that it's not clear how it's going to interact with anything physical. It's not clear how, if I've got a Cartesian type of mind, I can know about anybody else's. And Ryle argues that Descartes is guilty of a category mistake insofar as he thinks that the mind need not be connected up with intelligent behavior. Whereas Armstrong seems to raise some difficult questions for Ryle. Insofar as Ryle wants to characterize the mind as a set of multi-track dispositions towards intelligent behavior, Armstrong wants to ask, it seems rightly, that one should be able to pursue the question, well, we shouldn't just stop at dispositions, we should try to understand what is the physical basis for the dispositions that make us act in the ways that we do. And Armstrong's answer, his suggested answer, is maybe those dispositions are explainable in terms of aspects, processes, features of the central nervous system. Now, that is to say that Armstrong wants to argue that thinking just is a central nervous system kind of process, just as digestion is a process that happens inside of your stomach and intestines and related organs. So far, so good, but you might ask whether or not Armstrong's position is in a way chauvinistic. After all, we take it to be chauvinistic that, for example, the only way to be a thinking thing, count as truly having a mind, is if you've got a certain skin color. We would reject that position as being chauvinistic. So too, we would reject a position that says you've got to be male in order to count as having a mind, or a full mind, or a complete mind. No, we'll reject a position of that sort and say that gender makes no difference to whether or not you're capable of having a full and complete, highly successful and effective mind. But if we take those positions to be chauvinistic, maybe we should wonder about whether there's some hidden chauvinism inside of Armstrong's view, because he seems to be saying you've got to have a central nervous system in order to count as being a thinking thing. Is that perhaps too narrow, though? If you claim that thinking, emoting, experiencing are brain or at least central nervous system processes, that is, it seems to follow that the only way of having a mind is to be made at least roughly of the same sort of stuff that Homo sapiens are made of, or at least the central nervous system, the white matter and the gray matter that make that up. If you don't have white or gray matter, the Armstrong position seems to imply, then you don't count as a thing that thinks. Now, this might allow, for example, dolphins and chimpanzees the possibility of minds, but it seems to rule out, in principle, the possibility that, for example, a machine could think, that a machine could have one, or you might also imagine extraterrestrial life that develops, perhaps it's alive, it evolves, for instance, at some far corner of the universe, and yet it's made of entirely different stuff. Maybe these creatures are silicone-based rather than carbon-based in the way that we are, and they behave very intelligently. They come to Earth and they beat us in chess and write better poetry than we're able to, and so forth. All their behavior seems to be highly intelligent, and yet it would seem to be chauvinistic to say, nope, sorry, they don't have a mind because they don't have a central nervous system. That seems to be too narrow. So what can we do by way of trying to improve upon someone like Armstrong's position? Notice also that most of us will be happy to say that many inanimate objects, that is, objects that are not alive, that are not biological organisms at all, don't have mentality. Here's an image of a rock. That rock, most of us would say, it does not have a mind. If you were on a bus heading back home for Thanksgiving or something, and someone sat down next to you on the bus and took a rock like this out of their pocket and started talking to it, you might find yourself wishing you could move seats to somewhere else on the bus, or hope that this person will ignore you or fall asleep soon, because the idea of talking to a rock as if it's got a mind seems kind of crazy. Fair enough. But on the other hand, it looks like maybe the problem with rocks is that it's not so much what they're made of, but rather that they're just too simple. They don't seem to behave in intelligent ways. That suggests the possibility that perhaps a machine of a sufficiently sophisticated kind could count as thinking. And if we imagine machines, perhaps some of which would take the form of a humanoid type, we might wonder whether or not they could think, even if they have silicone chips and wires and things of the kind inside of their so-called bodies. One of the first thinkers to ask whether a machine could think was the mathematician Alan Turing. His dates were 1912 to 1954. He was instrumental in cracking the code used by the Nazis during World War II. He laid some crucial foundations for modern computer science. He also conjectured that it's in principle possible that a computer could be made to think. And he argued for this and by means of what is now known as the Turing test in a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. He asks us to imagine the following setup. Suppose you're in a room, and on opposite walls of that room are a computer screen and a keyboard. You're an interrogator, and you're trying to figure out whether the thing, you know that on one wall, behind one screen, is an actual human being, and behind the other screen, the other wall, is a very powerful computer, maybe IBM's Watson or some descendant thereof, extremely powerful computer. And your job is to figure out which is the human being and which is the machine. What's now known as the Turing test is a commonly used example that is supposed to show that if you cannot tell, after doing your very best to try to figure out which is the human being, which is the machine, then on the assumption that the human being you've been interacting with has a mind, you should also infer that the computer you've been interacting with has a mind as well. That is to say, if a computer can pass the so-called Turing test, then that computer should count as having a mind just as much as another human being should count as having a mind as well.